5 worst deaths in human history. Most deaths are quick, even the violent ones. A fall, a bullet, a car moving too fast on a wet road. The body fails, and it's over in seconds, sometimes less. This is not about those deaths. This is about 5 cases where the ending stretched on, where the body kept dying long after it should have stopped, days and sometimes months past the point most of us would call mercy. These are documented cases, not legend, drawn from court records, hospital charts, and eyewitness accounts written down while the ink was still wet. They run from a hospital ward in Japan in 1999 back to a battlefield in the 15th century, modern to ancient. What connects them isn't the method, it's the duration. Here are 5 of the worst deaths in human history. It is September 30th, 1999, at a nuclear fuel processing plant in Ibaraki Prefecture, Japan. 3 technicians are hand-mixing a batch of uranium solution inside a stainless steel tank, using buckets instead of the equipment designed for the job. It's a shortcut, one the plant had used before without incident. Hisashi Uchi, 35 years old, stands directly over the tank holding a funnel while a co-worker pours the solution in from above. A third man sits at a desk a few meters away. The plant belonged to a company called JCO. To save time, the workers had been trained, informally, to skip steps. Instead of feeding small measured amounts of uranium through narrow columns designed to make a chain reaction physically impossible, they were pouring it by hand into a wide precipitation tank. The geometry of that tank was the whole problem. Spread enough fissile material into a rounded container, and you build, without meaning to, the rough shape of a reactor core. Later, investigations found the workers had almost no real understanding of criticality. They thought they were mixing chemicals. They were assembling a bomb that would not explode so much as switch on. At 10:35 in the morning, the 7th bucket goes in. The mixture crosses into critical mass. The room fills with a flash of blue light. It's Cherenkov radiation, a signature of nuclear fission happening in real time, and it means the tank has become, for a few terrible seconds, an uncontrolled reactor. Ouchi collapses almost immediately. He is closer to the reaction than anyone else in the building, and his body absorbs somewhere between 16 and 17 sieverts of radiation. To put that number in context, doctors consider around 7 sieverts to be a universally lethal dose. Ouchi received more than double that. He's taken first to the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba, then transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital, where a specialized radiation medicine team takes over his care. At first, he doesn't look like a man who's been fatally poisoned. His face is a little red, his eyes bloodshot. He complains of pain in his hand and ears. One of the doctors examining him actually believes he might survive. Then the tests come back. 6 days after the accident, a specialist looks at images of Uchi's bone marrow cells under a microscope and finds his chromosomes in pieces, scattered like broken glass. It means his body has lost the ability to make new cells. Not damaged, lost. There's a difference between an injury a body can repair and a wound where the machinery for repair no longer exists, and Uchi now falls into the second category. His white blood cell count drops to near 0, wiping out his immune system entirely. A week in, his sister donates stem cells for a transplant, an experimental attempt to reboot his blood production from scratch. For a moment, it works. New white cells appear. Then the radiation damage catches up to the donor cells too, and the gain evaporates. Meanwhile, his skin is failing. When medical tape is removed from his chest, skin comes away with it. Over the following weeks, the outer layer of his body, the part meant to hold everything in and keep infection out, disintegrates. Fluid seeps out where skin should be, and doctors are replacing roughly 2 liters of it a day. Skin grafts are attempted. They don't hold because there's no living tissue underneath for them to bond to. His family folds paper cranes at his bedside, a quiet ritual running parallel to a body failing by the hour. By week 3, he can no longer eat and is fed intravenously. His organs, one after another, begin shutting down. He suffers a series of cardiac arrests, and each time, doctors bring him back. According to later reporting on his case, Uchi indicated at points that he did not want to continue, that he wanted to be allowed to die. His family, hoping for any chance of recovery, continued to authorize resuscitation. His treatment became a subject of quiet controversy afterward, a case study in how far intervention should go when the outcome is not in doubt. He survived 83 days. On December 21, 1999, his heart stopped one final time, and this time it was not restarted. The official cause of death was multiple organ failure. His co-worker, Masato Shinohara, who had received a smaller but still catastrophic dose, would die of the same cause 7 months later. In the aftermath, JCO lost its license to operate, and Japan tightened its rules on handling fissile material by hand. The accident remains one of the most severe radiation exposures ever recorded in a living human being. It is the morning of March 28, 1757, in Paris, France. In the Place de Grève, a large square in front of the Hôtel de Ville, a crowd has gathered for an execution the Parlement of Paris has designed to be the harshest the city has carried out in generations. The condemned man is Robert François Damien, a 42-year-old domestic servant. On January 5th of that year, he approached King Louis XV in the courtyard at Versailles and stabbed him with a small penknife. The blade went barely an inch into the king's side, stopped by his heavy winter coat. Louis was not seriously hurt, but in the eyes of French law, touching the king's body with violent intent counted as regicide, whether or not the king survived it. Damiens was arrested on the spot and never tried to run. To understand the punishment, it helps to understand what the crime was thought to mean. In 18th century France, the king's body was held to be sacred, an extension of the state and of God's order on earth. A wound to it, however slight, was read not as a personal injury, but as an attack on the entire structure of society. The Parlement of Paris never established that Damien had accomplices or a coherent political motive. He seems to have been an unstable man who had drifted through a string of jobs and grievances, but the law did not need a conspiracy. It reached back to the ancient penalty for parricide, because the king was understood as the father of his people. The Parlement sentenced him to that traditional punishment, a sentence built around a plain idea. Death should come last, after the body has been made to suffer as much as it can hold. On the morning of the execution, before he was even brought to the square, Damiens was tortured with the brodequins, a leg compression device, in an attempt to get him to name accomplices. He gave up no one of consequence. Then he was brought out in front of thousands of spectators, some of whom had paid for window seats overlooking the square. The executioners applied red-hot pincers to his chest, arms, thighs, and calves, tearing the flesh away in chunks, and the hand that had held the knife was burned. Into each wound left by the pincers they poured a mixture of molten lead, boiling oil, and burning resin and sulfur. Witness accounts, later transcribed by the philosopher Michel Foucault at the opening of his 1975 book Discipline and Punish, describe Damien screaming, then praying, then falling quiet, then crying out again as each new wound opened. Between rounds, witnesses say he lifted his head to look at his own body. After the burning, 4 horses were harnessed to his limbs, 1 to each arm and each leg, and driven in opposite directions to tear him apart. It didn't work. The horses weren't used to this kind of pulling, and after repeated attempts they were exhausted, and 1 collapsed. 2 more horses were brought in, and still the body held together. More than an hour in, the executioner asked permission to intervene directly. He and an assistant took knives and cut through the tendons and joints at Damien's shoulders and hips. Only then could the horses finish separating the limbs from the body. Accounts differ on exactly when Damiens stopped being conscious. Multiple witnesses, including the executioner's own men, reported that he was still breathing, and by some accounts still moving his jaws if speaking, even after his arms and legs had been pulled from his torso. What remained of him was then burned at the stake until his body was reduced to ash, and the ashes were scattered to the wind, so that nothing of him would remain to be buried or remembered. The whole event lasted several hours, from the first application of the pincers to the final burning of the remains. It remains one of the most thoroughly witnessed public executions in European history, recorded not just by court officials, but by ordinary spectators, including the Venetian adventurer Giacomo Casanova, who watched from a rented window and later wrote that he had to look away and cover his ears more than once. Damien's death arrived near the very end of this kind of spectacle in France. Within a generation, the guillotine, introduced during the Revolution as a deliberately swift machine, would replace the slow, staged ordeal entirely. His death became a fixed reference point in later writing about punishment, most famously in Foucault's account of it, precisely because so many people wrote down, in such detail, exactly what they saw. It is July 10th, 1584, at the Prinsenhof in Delft, in what is now the Netherlands. William the Silent, Prince of Orange, and the leader of the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, is climbing the staircase toward his dining room. A young man named Balthazar Gerard steps out from a dark corner and fires 2 pistol shots into his chest at close range. William collapses and dies within minutes. The killing sat at the center of one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in European history. For years, the Protestant provinces of the Low Countries had been in open revolt against the Catholic King of Spain, Philip II, who regarded their rebellion as both treason and heresy. William of Orange had become the revolt's political leader and its most durable symbol. In 1580, Philip formally outlawed him and offered a reward to anyone who would kill him, framing the assassination not as murder, but as a service to God and the crown. That decree drew a string of would-be killers toward Delft. Gerard had spent years working toward this moment. Philip had put a price on William's head, 25,000 crowns along with a title and land, and Gerard, a devout Catholic in his mid-20s, had built his entire plan around collecting it. He talked his way into William's household by posing as a French Protestant sympathizer and used money William's own staff had given him to buy the pistols that killed the prince. He didn't try hard to escape afterward. Household staff caught him within the grounds before he could reach the rampart he'd been aiming for. The magistrates of Delft now had to decide what to do with him, and what they settled on wasn't a single execution. It was a sentence built to last, engineered so that death would come only after days of accumulated damage to the body. Contemporary accounts describe a punishment carried out in distinct, spaced stages rather than one continuous ordeal, stretched across the 4 days between the assassination and Gerard's death on July 14th. His right hand, the one that had fired the gun, was burned away with a red-hot iron. Over those days, his flesh was torn from his body with iron pincers, 6 separate wounds by the magistrate's own sentence. Parts of his skin were removed entirely, a partial flaying carried out alongside the pincer work. Between these sessions, salt, vinegar, and other irritants were applied to the open wounds, not to clean them, but to keep the pain from dulling as the time wore on. The whole design was to keep him alive and aware for as long as the process could sustain. On the final day, Gerard was disemboweled while he was still alive. The written sentence itself ordered that his heart be torn from his chest and flung in his face before he was quartered and his head taken off. Some historians have noted that a decree of that kind can outrun what was physically carried out. So the heart detail belongs in the account as what the court formally commanded, alongside period reporting that describes it as done. What is beyond dispute from the surviving sentence is that he was quartered, and that his head was removed only after the rest of the punishment had run its course. Gerard reportedly never recanted the killing. Asked early on whether he felt remorse, he is said to have compared himself to David facing Goliath. Whatever he said in the days that followed, as the pincers and the iron did their work, wasn't recorded with the same care as his first defiant words. Philip II eventually made good on part of his promise. He couldn't pay the full bounty in coin, but he granted Gerard's family estates in France that had once belonged to William himself, and raised them into the nobility, just as he'd offered. William the Silent, meanwhile, entered the historical record in a grim first. The historian Lisa Jardine, in her study of the killing, argues that he was the first head of state assassinated with a handheld firearm, a small technological shift that would make the murder of rulers far easier than before. His death did not end the Dutch revolt. If anything, it hardened it, and the provinces he had led would go on to win their independence. It is July 29th, 1600, in Munich, Bavaria. A procession stretches half a mile through the streets, drawing crowds who've come to watch the execution of an entire family. Their real surname was Gempel. though history would remember them as the Pappenheimers. They are not nobles, not soldiers, not anyone of consequence in the ordinary sense. Paulus, the father, cleans privies for a living. His wife, Anna, comes from a family that dug graves. They travel from town to town doing whatever work no one else wants, and in Bavaria that makes them outsiders twice over, poor and rootless in a duchy that has just placed a young, zealous Catholic on the throne. The trial that brought them here belonged to one of the darkest currents of the age. Across German-speaking Europe in the late 16th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of people were tried and killed as witches, most of them poor, most convicted on confessions extracted under torture. Bavaria, under its new ruler, was becoming a stronghold of the Catholic reform movement, and its rulers saw the hunting of witches as both a religious duty and a show of state power. Into that machinery walked a wandering family with no protectors. Duke Maximilian I, the Elector of Bavaria, wanted to make an example. The Pappenheimers had first been named by a captured thief who, facing his own execution, accused them of robbery and murder. Under judicial torture, standard practice in that era's inquisitorial courts, they went on to confess to witchcraft as well, to riding through the air and murdering children. Confession under those conditions wasn't evidence of guilt, so much as evidence that the torture had continued long enough. It didn't matter. The court had what it needed, and the case, one of the most publicized witch trials in German history, was reconstructed centuries later from the Bavarian court records by the historian Michael Kunze in his study High Road to the Stake. The execution itself follows a sequence designed to be seen, step by step, by as many people as possible. Paulus is stripped, and his flesh is torn away with red-hot pincers as the procession moves through the streets, the wounds left open the whole way. At the execution ground, the men of the family are broken on the wheel, struck with an iron bar until their bones give way joint by joint. Paulus is subjected to a further particularly brutal act of impalement before the fire. Only then are they burned. Anna suffers a different, deliberately degrading form of mutilation before she too is burned alive. The specific details, preserved in the court records Kunze worked from, are graphic enough that they are best left in restrained terms. She was mutilated in a way meant to humiliate as much as to hurt, in full view of the crowd, and then burned while still alive. Standing among the onlookers, forced to watch all of it, is the youngest member of the family, a boy of about 10. He watches his father broken on the wheel. He watches his mother burn. The court had kept him alive on purpose, in part to observe him, and what the officials read in his reactions during the execution seems to have decided his fate. He was not spared. Months later, on November 26 of the same year, the boy was executed too, folded into the same judicial proceeding that had already consumed the rest of his family. None of this happened by accident or by simple legal momentum. Kunze's research into the Bavarian archives makes clear that the form and sequence of the execution were shaped as much by political theater as by law. Maximilian wanted his subjects to see what happens to those the court has decided are instruments of the devil, and a family cleaned out completely, down to a child, makes a more lasting impression than a single execution ever could. The case became a landmark in the Bavarian witch persecutions, and stands now as one of the most fully documented atrocities of the European witch craze. It is the summer of 1462, in the countryside outside Târgoviște, in the Principality of Wallachia, in what is now southern Romania. An Ottoman army under Sultan Mehmed II, the same commander who had taken Constantinople 9 years earlier, is marching north to bring the region's ruler, Vlad III, to heel after years of broken tribute and open defiance. Wallachia sat on a fault line between two empires, the Ottoman power to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, and its rulers survived by playing one against the other. Vlad had chosen defiance. He had refused the tribute owed the Sultan and raided across the Danube, and Mehmed had come to replace him with a more obedient candidate, Vlad's own brother. Vlad's reign, spanning several periods between 1448 and 1462, had already made him a name of dread in German-speaking lands, where printed pamphlets, the earliest surviving edition produced in Nuremberg in the 1480s, described his methods in detail. Those pamphlets were in part hostile propaganda. But the Ottoman court historian Tursun Beg, traveling with Mehmed's army, would leave his own first-hand account of what they found on that march. And on the central fact, the sources agree. Vlad's signature method was impalement, and the descriptions examined by modern scholars including Radu Florescu, Raymond McNally, and Mate Kazeku agree on details that separate it from a simple execution. The stake wasn't sharpened to a fine point. It was blunted, rounded, and reportedly oiled. It was driven into the body along a path built to avoid the vital organs, entering low and emerging near the shoulder, missing the heart and lungs entirely. The victim was then hoisted upright, and gravity did the rest. Under the body's own weight, the stake worked its way further through the torso, slowly, over hours. Some accounts describe victims surviving upright like this for a day or more, which was the point. The method was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to keep the dying visible for as long as possible. That, more than the count, is what made the scene outside Targovishte so effective. On the night of June 16th, Vlad had led a raid straight into the Ottoman camp, trying to kill the Sultan himself. The attack failed to reach Mehmed but shook the army badly. Days later, as the Ottomans advanced toward the empty capital, they came upon the accumulated result of Vlad's method on a mass scale. A field of bodies raised on stakes, arranged as a message aimed at the men marching toward the city. The numbers have long been disputed. A figure of over 20,000 appears in a contemporary Greek account, and Vlad himself, in a surviving letter to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, boasted of tens of thousands killed across his campaign. More recent research has treated those totals with caution, arguing the true figures were likely smaller, while agreeing that the field of stakes was real and staged for effect. Whatever the number, the sources agree on the outcome. Mehmed's forces, faced with the sight, withdrew rather than press the advance on the capital, and one Greek historian records the Sultan conceding a grudging respect for a man who could rule his realm through such terror. The withdrawal did not save Vlad. Within weeks, the Ottomans installed his brother, and Vlad fled to Hungary, where he was imprisoned for years by the very king he had appealed to for help. He returned to power only briefly before dying in battle around 1476. The pattern of terror would follow his name for the rest of his life and long after it, reshaped by enemies and allies alike into propaganda, and eventually into fiction that had almost nothing to do with the man who first raised those stakes outside his own capital. 5 cases, 5 centuries apart, but the shape underneath them barely changes. A body made to keep failing long after failure should have ended it. Whether by radiation, by pincers and horses, by fire, or by a stake driven slow through the torso, the methods belonged to their own time. The engineering behind the suffering did not.